Today's panel will focus on whether and how we can cooperate to limit the human and economic damage caused by this global pandemic and the deterioration in U.S. China relations. Now on to our panelists. Since their bios are on the event page of our website, let me just say that these are four of America's and China's outstanding economic thinkers who have contributed enormously to U.S. China relations through their positions in government, through our Track 2 dialogues, their writings, and many other fora. We have Yao Yang, who is our partner in this Track 2 dialogue, and it's the director of CCER and the dean of Peking University's National School of Development. We have Feng, who briefs many of our delegations who go to China and is a professor of economics at the National School of Development at PKU. We have Lardy, who's a vice chair of the National Committee and is the Anthony M. Solomon Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And finally, we have Bob Rubin, who was America's 70th Secretary of the Treasury, is a participant in our Track 2 dialogue, and is currently co-chairman emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. So with no further ado, I'll ask Bob to kick it off with 5 to 7 minutes of comments. We'll then go on to Feng, Nick, and Yao Yang. I'll have a discussion with them, and then we'll open the floor to questions from our attendees. Bob, thank you so much for your service, and thank you for joining us this morning. And you need to unmute yourself.
I will begin, Steve, by commenting broadly on the U.S. China relationship, and then I'll comment more specifically for a few moments on how it affects dealing with these twin crises, which obviously are of monumental importance to each of our countries and the global economy. About a year ago, I moderated a discussion at the Council of Foreign Relations with the Foreign Minister of China. And what I said is something that I've long believed and believe now, which is that there are enormous complexities and uncertainties around the relationship between China and the United States. I say those complexities have increased, unfortunately. But while that is all very uncertain, what seems to me to be not at all uncertain and not at all complex is that the 21st century, life in the 21st century, is going to be enormously affected, for better or for worse, by whether or not the United States and China can establish a reasonable and sensible, constructive relationship, or we have an adversarial relationship. Furthermore, when you look at our two economies, I believe that each of our economies faces huge challenges. Having said that, it does seem to me that the probabilities are high that our very different political systems will meet the challenges that we need to meet to succeed, and I suspect that the odds are pretty high, probably very high, that we will both do very well over the decades ahead. And I think it is although there's certainly no guarantee, and as I said a moment ago, it does depend, I think, very largely on whether our domestic political systems, the two very different systems, are able to meet our challenges. I also think, although I know this is a view that is not broadly, is not held, although I know there's a view that many in our country don't hold, and I suspect the same may be true in China, I think it is enormously interest of both our countries that the other ones succeed economically. I have an impression, and I have had this for quite some time, maybe right, it may be wrong, that there are those in China, maybe many in China, who, I was at the U.S. Embassy some years ago, and the chief of station said to me that many in China think that the United States is leaving the station and China is entering the station, and that we will not be successful in the years and decades ahead. I think that is almost surely wrong, highly likely wrong. Similarly, there are many in the United States who have views about the Chinese economy that seem to me wrong. One is a serious tendency to underweight the challenges that China faces, demographic, environmental, political, and so many others. And the other is to overweight those challenges and to believe that the Chinese government is unlikely to meet its challenges. As I say, I think both of them are likely wrong. As has often been said, but I think too seldom really understood and internalized, that there are hugely consequential challenges, transnational challenges, that can enormously, I think even catastrophically, affect both of our countries, that neither one or any country is strong enough to deal with by itself. And the obvious examples are climate change and nuclear weapons, future pandemics, as we've unfortunately, tragically learned in the case of the coronavirus, and others. We can certainly choose, as we seem to be at the present time, not to work together and to move toward an ever more adversarial relationship, but I think that path will truly be catastrophic for both of our countries. Because I think that path greatly increases the risk that these catastrophic risks will materialize in ways that will be deeply damaging. Also, we would both greatly benefit from a global economic regime with agreed upon norms with respect to trade and cross-border investment. In the United States, I think until we get through the election, I think the politics around China are going to be very difficult. And I think that's inevitable, and it often happens in U.S. election periods. My hope is that after the election and come January, that independently of who wins, although I think it probably is could be somewhat more than affected by who wins, but that in either case, there's at least a reasonable chance that there will be a more objective evaluation of the benefits of a constructive relationship about our mutual self-interest, and that we will go into a mode more of competing economically and geopolitically, hopefully within the context of international norms, at the same time work together on our mutual self-interest with respect to the kinds of issues I mentioned before, and also recognizing there are real differences between us with respect to human rights, but also many other matters. I think, unfortunately, a major obstacle to that kind of vision, certainly in the United States, but I have the impression this is true in China as well, is that the animosity exists not only at the government level, but also more broadly in our societies. I think there's plenty of blame to go around, and we could each point our fingers in all kinds of different ways with respect to how the other has acted. And as I say, I think there's plenty of blame to go around. But if we're going to move forward, I think we have to put that behind us and then focus on the vision, or if you will, the sense of what our relationship should be that I mentioned a moment ago. Having said that, we also have to be realistic and recognize that even if in each of our countries, that even if we adopt a constructive approach or attempt to adopt a constructive approach, the other may not be receptive. And so I think we do have to have contingency plans that relate to the notion, the possibility that the other will not respond. But those, it seems to me that what's critically important is that the development of those plans not interfere with the movement toward a constructive relationship. On the coronavirus itself, it seems to me we could benefit greatly by far more extensive sharing of data and research and the like. Unfortunately, at the government level, that'll probably be pretty difficult, at least for now. But it is happening at the university research level, and I think it's critical that the governments not interfere with what is going on at that level. On the economic crisis, I believe that the issues that each of us face need to be dealt with primarily, or predominantly actually, by our domestic political system. But the two countries certainly could work together to develop international norms with respect to trade and cross-border investment. And unfortunately, the globe is going in the wrong direction. And there's plenty of blame to go around on that, as I said. Going in the wrong direction, we could work together to reestablish effective and constructive norms. And there is another problem, which is many emerging market countries are facing what I think are catastrophic conditions. And that is not only a vast humanitarian problem, but I think it can enormously affect our countries as well. The spread of disease, immigration, various other areas, terrorism, etc. So hopefully we will work on all this together. I think, Steve, having these kinds of discussions is a very constructive contribution to trying to develop a better understanding in both of our countries of all that I've just discussed. Thank you.
Yep. Great, Bob. Yep. Feng.
Thank you, Steve. I very much like the talk by Bob, especially the point what will happen about with regard to U.S. and China relationships after the general election. So we believe, at the beginning of last year, visit to D.C. and New York, we assume that maybe the worst time is the general election, but now we're not that sure anymore. Okay. Anyway, I would like to divert a little bit the topic, to share and some of my thoughts on how international community should collaborate to cope with the current economic downturn. We all know that the pandemic not only caused the once a century public health crisis, but also brought about by, and worldwide economic downturn that is even more severe than the financial crisis, more than a decade ago. So when the financial turmoil occurred first in the Wall Street in more than 10 years ago, then spread to the world, caused and the financial global financial crisis. Actually, the international community then, and united together, on the basis creation of the G20 and the summit platform, and together, fight against the crisis on the belief of the principle that the global crisis should be fought against with, and the global approach. So I think this kind of principle is also relevant in the current and circumstances. So the world community should also adopt the principle to combat the economic downturn, with special emphasis, in my understanding at least, in the following areas. The number one, to combat effectively the economic crisis, we need to for the first of all, strengthen the efforts to fight against the pandemics as the primary causes of the economic crisis. Now we still have daily incremental growth of the new cases around 100,000 each day in recent days. So it is still a long way to go to achieve the final eradication of the coronavirus. The international cooperation urgently needed in the areas such as speed up of the scientific research in delivering safe and efficiently cure, as well as vaccine. We also should pay attention to the long term. We also need to share medical supplies of high quality, helping the poor countries to dealing with the difficult situations. We also need to pay attention to the long-term issues, such as how to improve information sharing, transparency, strengthening, and improving the functioning of WHO, creating the global stockpile of the medical supplies as part of the preparedness for the future pandemics. Number two, I think international community need to collaborate the proactive macroeconomic policies as the urgent responses to the economic crisis. So far, various unprecedented level scale of economic stimulus packages has been designed and implemented for almost all the major economies. While specific stimulus packages of different scale and structure are the matter determined on the basis of national governments, there have also been, we can witness also been active consultation and discussions in the process of macroeconomic policy formation in the recent months in various ways in the platforms of the G20 Ministry of Finance, as well as central bank governors meeting, even the video conference and even the video summits of G20 international organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank, G7, as well as regional institutions arrangements such as the ASEAN+3 in this part of the world. The similar practices should be continuously pursued so as to avoid negative spillovers of this macroeconomic policy and maximizing the positive policy impacts. Number three, I think we need to collaborate so as to preventing and controlling financial risks. Though the initial shocks of the pandemic on the stock markets in the U.S. and other countries has been, absorbed and dealt with quite successfully through huge coordinated monetary intervention of the unprecedented scale. Other financial risks are emerging or increasing, especially in the emerging economies as well as developing economies, because of the either interruption of the international payments of the, as a result from devastating effects of the pandemics over exports for many countries, or collapse of, the primary prices for the oil and bulk commodity markets in recent months, or simply because deteriorating of the quality of assets for banks and other financial institutions. There are four pillars of the financial safety network for the global world, for the world at the moment. So individual countries reserve, bilateral swaps, among different countries for the central banks, as well as the regional arrangements such as the, CMA in ASEAN plus 3 areas, as well as multilateral institutions such as the IMF. So of all these four components, the three excluding first one, they need international coordination. So I think we need to pay attention in this area. Fourthly, the number four, we need to make mutual efforts to secure the global food security. Though the direct impact of the pandemic on grain production is limited, the global food security situation faces special challenges this year, mainly because two reasons. Number one, some grain and cereal exporting countries temporarily suspended exports of wheat, rice, and other grains, even including vegetables. Okay. Additionally, number two, the plague of the desert locust has struck the countries in the Horn of Africa, such as Djibouti, Somalia, Ethiopia, and even threatening part of the West Pakistan as well as India. So far, the international community have done solid work in stabilizing the situation. For example, both ASEAN plus 3 leader video conference on 14 April, as well as G20 agriculture minister video conference meeting on 21 April, all discussed the matter and expressed commitments in assuring the stable functioning of the international grain market. So now the situation has been stabilized a little bit, but we still need to be vigilant on this area. Finally, number four, I think international collaboration are particularly needed to manage the upcoming process of adjustments of the global value chain, as well as the economic globalization. I don't have the time to mention this, elaborate on this point, okay, because my time is limited, is exhausting. So the final point I want to make is that now the world economy is still under the tremendous pressure. China's economy are already on the track of the recovery thanks to the more effective controlling domestic epidemic, but it may not be able to converge to the potential growth rate on the annual basis until next year. The economics of the US and the EU and other important Western countries may not recover to the pre-crisis level until the year after next year, according to the market projection. Also, the already made international cooperation has been achieved positive results. There are still wide gaps between the necessity and the reasonable expectation on the one hand in this area and what should be done on the other hand. International community needs to further strengthen cooperation to combat the existing and upcoming economic challenges. Thank you.
Okay, great. Nick, Lardy, you're up.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for organizing this. I'm happy to appear with my colleagues, and I'm going to, quite frankly, be much more pessimistic than either Bob or Lu Feng. I think in the United States, what we have seen almost from the beginning of the Trump administration is what in China would be called a two-line struggle between moderates in terms of their policy towards China and hawks. And I think what has happened in recent months is that the hawks have gained a decisive upper hand. And in part, it's because of the pandemic. And I think this is reflected extremely strongly in this new document that was released about 10 days ago, which is called United States Strategic Approach to the People's Republic of China. This is available on the White House website, and it is an attempt to set forth a coherent policy for U.S. relations with China. It is extremely negative. I think the chances for any cooperation on a significant level between China and the United States over the balance of this administration is zero. And I don't share Bob's view that things might get better if Trump is reelected, but I hope I'm wrong. Now, let me just say, this is a document that wholeheartedly embraces what they refer to as policies of strategic competition. There's no talk about engagement or win-win or anything like that. All of the, it's a full approach to decoupling. It talks extensively about reducing trade relationships, reducing particularly US imports from China, and reducing the flow of technology. It doesn't address capital flows that Bob alluded to, but we can see in several dimensions this is coming independently, even though it's not mentioned in the strategic document. So I think we're going to see less trade, less capital flows, less technology flows. The document is almost, and this is especially disappointing, the document is almost entirely defensive. There's nothing in it about US policies that would help our economy and help to preserve our strengths in various areas of technology and so forth. It's all about slowing down China. As I say, it's defense, not offense. Even in the section where they talk about policies to promote American prosperity, the only specific thing they mention is strengthening our nuclear triad. There's nothing on economics or anything to do with income distribution or anything. It's all our nuclear power. The document at one point does pay lip service, and this is our topic today, to potential areas of cooperation, but they don't give a single example. They're not talking about the transnational challenges that Bob mentioned, or the desirability of adopting international norms in new areas that would smooth relations between the two countries. Needless to say, of course, they can't mention climate change since Trump doesn't seem to believe in that. So there's lip service to cooperation, but not a single word on what areas those might be. So this is a document that's entirely about competition, confrontation, not cooperation. A couple more points. The message throughout this document is imposing costs on China. There's not the slightest recognition that this usually entails some costs on the United States. Tariffs would be perhaps the most obvious example. Not only is there no mention of costs to the United States, there's no talk about costs, no talk about measuring costs, the economists would want to know, okay, if this is your strategy, what costs can we impose compared to what costs we will have to endure ourselves? There's lip service to importance of US allies in this effort, but there's no real evidence of efforts made in that direction. There's no hint of possible results. So I think it's a very, very discouraging document. And I think the hawks, Navarro and those around him, have decisively won the internal battle on the way to deal with China. As I say, I think for the first 3 years or so, we had a two-line struggle, and we had a president who flitted back and forth unpredictably between one camp and the other, sometimes saying we need more of this or that, and other times being very tough on China. But I think the COVID and the combination of the COVID and the coming election has shifted the balance entirely in favor of the hawks. And I don't see any prospect that that's going to change. So I think we're in for a very, very bad period in economic relations between the two countries.
Anything else to cheer us up, Nick? Oh boy. Yao Yang.
I would say, go to the website and read the document. Maybe you can find some optimism in it. I can't.
Okay, my turn. Okay, I used to be quite optimistic about U.S. China relations. I remember more than 10 years ago when I first met Steve to talk about the U.S. China Track 2 dialogue. I had that optimism. But unfortunately, this time I share a lot with Nick. I become quite pessimistic about the U.S. China relations. I think a new kind of Cold War is looming large of the two countries, right? So it's not just in our imagination. It has become much more real after the coronavirus, right? And let me just talk about several elements of this new kind of Cold War. One was already mentioned by Nick, that is economic confrontation. I can understand if the United States does not want to buy, say, Huawei's products, right? But let's just think about the entity list, right? The criteria are so vague. Right? It only says if the United States believes that a foreign company is threatening American national security, then that company can be put onto the entity list. By now, I think 33 Chinese companies are now on the list. Most of them are in the high-tech area, right? So that's caused a lot of discussions within China, right? To a large extent, to me, this action is very close to action of war, right? So the purpose is just to kill China's high-tech industry from the very beginning, right? I don't know if the Trump administration has ever thought about China's retaliation. China has not retaliated, right? But that doesn't mean that China does not have any means to retaliate, right? Even without the retaliation from China, it's going to be bad for American companies, right? Think about those high-tech companies in the United States. 30%, I think in the Qualcomm case, 60% of its revenue comes from sales to China, right? So if you stop selling to China, how can Qualcomm compete in the international market, right? So it's kind of you're killing golden goods, okay, for the American high-tech industry. Second, on the geopolitical front, we know that the confrontation has begun a long time ago, but after coronavirus has become more of an issue, right? You know, China was the first country to walk out the pandemic. So China offered humanitarian aid to many countries, including countries in Europe. Europe has become kind of nervous about China's influence, but the United States, of course, has become much more nervous. Of course, China's approach, recent approach by some diplomats was also problematic. But overall, this kind of a geopolitical competition has already affected the world efforts to combat the pandemic. For example, the function of WHO, right? Last but not least, that's ideological confrontation. As Bob already said, we have two different systems, right? But during the pandemic, China was depicted even worse, right? In Americans' minds, China succeeded is because China has an authoritarian government, right? So this kind of disinformation, you can see it has caused a lot of discontent from Americans toward China. So the number of people now who have negative views on China account for 2/3 of Americans. So that's such a sea change compared to, say, even just 3 years ago. Okay. So with all this, how can we talk about collaboration between the two countries? I would say probably we should work together, and not work together. The two countries should work separately to contain competition, right, or to manage competition. Okay. Think about that in the technological arena, right? If you want to compete, you should compete like two boxers in the ring. You should not first cripple the other guy and say, you come onto the stage and then let's fight, okay? So at least we should have some basic rule for competition, okay? For that, I strongly recommend that the two countries start the phase 2 talk quickly, right? So I think the two governments have almost forgotten, we were about to enter a phase 2 talk. Right? The phase 2 talk, I don't believe is going to be concluded very soon, but as long as the two countries sit at the table and talk to each other, then that's good, right? At least you can talk something, right? Okay. On geopolitical side, I don't think competition can be avoided, right? In South China Sea, China's BRI, and also, the fighting the coronavirus. China's influence will increase for sure. And I think the only thing the two countries can do is to manage this competition, right? Not to allow the competition to get into some real confrontation, okay? On the ideological side, I totally agree with Bob. The two countries have to realize we have two different systems. And then particularly for Americans, one thing that's missing is that the Chinese system is built on the Chinese traditional ideas, okay? There are traditional ideas behind, okay? So we should not just, distinguish China as an authoritarian country, United States as a democracy. There are values behind those two systems. And I don't think you can just blindly reject the Chinese values, okay? So for that, I would call for Americans to seriously think about and treat the Chinese values, okay? And in the words of British China scholar Carol Brown's words, is that probably it's time for the West to think about that the Chinese values will be there for a long time, and the West has to live with a quite different set of values. Okay, let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank all four of you for very interesting presentations. First question is a two-part question, one part for the Chinese side and one part for the U.S. side. Yao Yang and Lu Feng, you know, when we were in Washington, I think it was January 12th, it was 3 days before the signing of phase one. There was some optimism. So the first question is there any way that China is going to be able to implement phase one? And then the question for Bob and Nick is, because I think I know the answer, is if it is not implemented, what are the implications? What is the United States going to do? What is this administration going to do? Because it's going, no matter what you think about January of 2021, phase one, you will know if phase one is going to be implemented before then. So first, Yao Yang and Lu Feng. Any way it could be implemented?
Well, I'm not an expert on trade, but I just have the guess that China is still going to honor the agreement, but the implementation will be prolonged. Right? So it's going to be hard for China to meet the target set for this year and the next year. Probably if we can extend into like 3 years or even 4 years, that's going to be much easier for China to fulfill the agreement.
Lu Feng, anything on that?
So, two points. Number one, I think China has made a great effort in implementing the phase one deal, trade deal. I give you a couple of the numbers in this context. For example, in the how can I say, in the quarter three, you know, the third quarter last year, actually China China imports from United States declined on the annual basis by more than 31%. Okay, 31%. So something like 24 percentage points higher, you know, than the overall imports of China, you know, from rest of the world. So in other words, there's a huge decline of the imports from United States. The quarter one, the last quarter, China's imports from United States, growth rates of China's imports from United States are exactly equal the overall imports growth rate, even though it is still below zero. It's something like, you know, and negative 3.4%. Okay, on the agriculture, especially from agricultural imports, the quarter one is something like $5 billion. Okay, it's doubled, more than doubled than the first quarter last year. So that indicates China's, you know, implementation and efforts are very vigorous. Okay, but it's still way below than, you know, and 2017. That is the $9 billion. So then the first observation for me is that actually Chinese government take it very seriously to implement the deal. Number two, I agree with Yao Yang, actually, because the pandemics, you know, and introduced a tremendous disruption for the trade plan for the overall economic environment. So implementation process, you know, and may be interrupted to some extent. So I think it's realistic to assume that we can do that exactly according to the plan. Actually, it's totally unexpected when we signed the deal at the beginning of this year, you know, then there's out of the blue, there's a pandemic. So maybe we need to be realistic on that regard. So fortunately, we see actually, I have some empathy with the Nick's observation, but also have some conservations. There's still some, how can I say, positive elements, you know, in the reality. Actually, on the May 8th, there's talks, you know, by the phone between Vice Premier Liu He on China, you know, with his counterparts in United States, Mr. Heitleiser as well as Mr. Munich. So general tone of the communique is positive. I don't know what behind the door, but on the basis of my personal observation, if the general announced, and the texts are in positive, general speaking, it reflects the reality behind the door. So I think we need to be realistic. We need to allow some flexibility in implementation of the plan.
Nick or Bob? Nick?
Well, no one's, the phase one agreement has two parts. One is the one we always pay attention to, the extra 200 billion in Chinese imports from the United States. That may or may not be possible, probably technically could be done. It would involve a huge amount of trade diversion. It's a big number, but compared to Chinese imports, which are closing in on 2 trillion a year, it's not impossible. But I would say we need to pay more attention to the fact that China has followed through on its commitments to improve, revise and improve the foreign trade law, increase protection for intellectual property, trademarks, opening up the financial sector, which has moved ahead fairly strongly. And the business community is actually very happy, at least the U.S. business community is very happy with this aspect of the phase one agreement. So it may be a stretch to get to that 200 billion, extra 200 billion over 2 years, but there are a lot of other dimensions of the agreement that we shouldn't lose sight of. And I think they do reflect the fact that China is moving ahead to implement the agreement.
Bob?
Yeah, I just had one brief comment. I agree with Nick, and I also agree that the U.S. business community seems, as far as I can tell at least, based on what our clients say, to be pleased with that. I personally think that the 200 billion of mandated buying was a misguided way to think about global trading relationships anyway. So whether China can fulfill them or not, I think it was a very badly misguided way to think about trade.
Yeah. Question from Intel, which kind of from Brian Dargett at Intel, who's asking about the restrictions on semiconductor exports and the implications of that for China's goal of technology independence, which then touches on an article, a headline in the Wall Street Journal today, which is the U.S. can kill Huawei. And that basically over the next 12 months, we're going to see Huawei's inability to purchase the high quality chips manufactured, as I think Yao Yang said, or Lu Feng said, by Qualcomm, Intel, and others, is going to make it so it can't be a world-class company anymore. What do you think about both of those concepts, Yao Yang, Lu Feng?
Oh, well, I think that's a misunderstanding about Huawei. So there are kind of Huawei has two parts of business. Okay, one is the smartphone line, right? Actually, the smartphone is a new business in Huawei, right? Huawei's core competence is not in smartphone, it's actually in the communication devices, technology like a 5G, okay? So I think if the United States just shut the door completely to Huawei, then probably Huawei's smartphone business will be severely affected in the short run. Okay, that's also for sure, because smartphones use really advanced chips. The most advanced iPhone actually use 5 nanometer chips. Okay, but if we are talking about the other line of business, Huawei, that is telecommunication, we really don't need 5 nanometer chips, right? I'm not an expert on this, but probably 14 nanometer or even 17 or even 21 are just enough. So that's not going. So the ban is not going to kill Huawei. And in the meantime, Huawei is finding alternatives within China. Okay, so I want to add to this. If the U.S. really want to go for this, that's going to force China to develop its own chips industry. right, to invest heavily into this, because this is the competition for the future. Okay, China can do that, can put tons of money into that business, not in 3 years, but definitely in 5 years, or latest in 7 years. China can catch up, right? And that's not a good story for American companies.
Yeah. Lu Feng, anything on that? You got to unmute. Lu Feng, unmute.
2 points. Number one, I think, of course, United States is a superpower. If United States, and using ordinary, government power to curtail Huawei, it will make Huawei very difficult in a lot of aspects. Okay, I'm sure about that. But I don't think it will kill Huawei. It will be difficult, slow in certain aspects, but Chinese domestic market is huge, and if you do that, and it will also, like also Nick mentioned, it will counterproductive, for United States as well. On the other hand, this, the point two, I want to make is that I'm not sure whether, it is definitely the final strategy adopted by the United States already. There's a mixed informations, for example, I don't know, I'm not expert in this area. If you read the media that says there's some offer from the United States, you can collaborate with Huawei, share, all these kind of the patents, Also, I don't know what will happen, maybe several hours later about, Mengwan. So I don't know. So I think the policy adopted by the United States is tough, especially the documents highlighted by Nick, it is issued by president, I'm not sure whether it also indicates something different, it's not by a ministry or departments, okay. Sure, it's hardlining, also in China, inside China, there's sort of the hardlining tones in the policy. But on the other hand, I don't think that there's no flexibility whatsoever, anymore. Actually, if you observe what happened in the recent months, especially in the March, in running up to the video conference of G20 summit, actually, we have very difficult situations in terms of, where these coronavirus come about. That's very controversial, very sensitive. Then you observe some kind of the subtle diplomacies, has been occurred on both sides, on both countries, then at least temporarily, they eased up the tension, then paved the way for the summit. So I agree, the situation is very tough. It's much more complicated than beginning of this year, but I still think it's not the end of the day. Thank you.
Steve, can I come in on this?
Sure.
I would not bet against Huawei in this circumstance, and I'd point to several things. First, according to their 2019 annual report, they had $24 billion of stockpiled parts and components. Secondly, TSMC will be able to continue to deliver all of the goods that were on order prior to the time this new executive decision came out of the U.S. government. So we don't know what how big those orders are, but they're going to continue to get very substantial shipments over the next 120 days from TSMC. Third, TSMC is a very smart, sophisticated company. My prediction is at the end of the 120 days, TSMC is going to start applying for licenses. There's no prohibition on selling to Huawei. You have to get a license. Well, yes. Is Huawei going to get a license to sell, continue to sell to Huawei? I'm betting they will. And if they don't, what's going to happen to their $12 billion investment in Arizona? They're going to slow walk it, downgrade it. This will be very bad for Trump in the run up to the election. He's claiming, that he's reshoring all this manufacturing. This is a big part of his strategy of, U.S. Strength in manufacturing, particularly in high tech. TSMC doesn't have to invest $12 billion in in Arizona. They may be getting a lot of incentives that hasn't been disclosed, but it will take months and months, if not, the thing isn't going to be up and running even under the best of circumstances until 2022. My forecast is if they don't get licenses, they will slow walk it and maybe even completely walk away from it. So TSMC is in a stronger position than most people recognize. Remember, they announced this deal in Arizona 2 days before the new executive order came out from the US government. They knew this was coming. This investment is a way for them to gain leverage.
Bob?
I just add one sentence, Steve. I don't know anything about the national security issues relating to Huawei, but what I do think is that being an unreliable supplier is a highly disadvantageous place to be in the global economy over the long run. And I think that each time we do this with sanctions, we should be extremely careful, because if we create, in the view of the global economy, that we are an unreliable supplier, it may serve some short-term interest, it may not, but I think almost surely it will hurt us substantially over time.
Yeah, I think 2 points. One, Nick's point that this is not a prohibition, it's just a requirement to secure a license is very, very important. And China needs to recognize this, that this is not a prohibition, it's just a requirement to get a license. Bob's point with respect to sanctions raises an interesting question, which is China, and this is for Yao Yang and Feng. China is moving ahead with this digital currency that PBOC has now put it in place with a bank, with I think Construction Bank in certain test areas. Is that related to financial sanctions that the United States is now, I would argue, overusing? That the use of digital currency, to the extent it internationalizes, kind of protects the users from being sanctioned by the US government?
Well, I think Yigang just said it's not the time for China to issue any digital currency. Right. So I think what he was saying was that China is not going to circulate digital currency, right, in the near future.
It's entered into experiments. It announced experiments that it's doing now. It's not, yes, it's not widespread, but it's entered. Like China's policy is always cross the river, across the stream by stepping on rocks, and this is kind of the first rock.
Right. But there are talks in the market for kind of your idea, right? That is, China should create a kind of a digital currency so we can circumvent the United States, right? So we don't need to use US dollars, okay? So that's kind of the thinking of that, but I don't know if that's in the mind of Yigang. We haven't talked with him yet.
I think maybe.
Feng, go ahead.
Maybe that is too much speculation. I think actually PBOC started to have a serious study on this digital currency issue from something like 2014. So generally speaking, the high officials, in China, most of them have the engineer background, different from United States, maybe from the lawyer or from others. So they are very interested in these technologies. If there's a new technology, they're very fancy about that. That is the mentality of the engineering. So I think I don't think it's have anything to do with the currency war. Number two, I think actually they're not experimenting on the currency, digital currency, only substitution for the currency, okay, for the coins and the notes, for this, and the currency rather than broad money. It's not like Libra, okay. Libra is very much revolutionary, okay. That will have sort of the, alternative to the US dollars if, let's assume, hopefully not, let's assume, because of this, the injection of the money in a massive way, especially the debates about the modern monetary theory, okay? So if the government really adopted that, I know Bob maybe have a strong opinion of that. I don't know. No, there's very active discussion inside China about that topic. If that happened, if that adopted as a mainstream policy in states, then something goes wrong. Maybe something like the Libra will save United States in the extreme circumstances. But digital currency experimented in China now, that's only substitute for the currency, for the coins and the notes. It's not, it's so difficult to imagine Chinese government will adopted some philosophy behind the Libra. So in other words, give up or compromise on the sovereignty.
It's very different. It's very different from Facebook.
Okay,
Libra,
it's totally different. So it's finally, of course, Yao Yang is correct. It's only in the experimental phase. There's no timeline, limit, timetable for the introducing of the currency.
I have a question, and then I want to promote Professor Jia Zhong to be a panelist and directly ask a question. My question, and while we're doing that, let me ask my question. I think there seems to be a consensus in the panel that we're in for a very dark period. That is dark as it is going to get darker. So my question really is, during this period, it may be 5 months, it may be a much longer period. We don't know, 8 months, maybe years. What should we be doing on the economic side to kind of put a floor under the deterioration? What kind of policies should we be suggesting be adopted? Yeah.
Well, as Nick said, on the China side, the Chinese government has moved quite decisively to open up the markets. Right? So when I listened to Premier Li Keqiang's work report, I was struck by yet another move to open up the services sector. He said China is going to further shorten the negative list, including negative list in the services sector. Of course, we don't know the government's plan yet, but if that negative list can be really shortened in the services sector, that's going to help American companies quite dramatically.
Yeah. Feng, anything on that, or Bob or Nick?
Okay, so I agree that, actually at the beginning of my talk, I said, and at the beginning of last year, we assumed that maybe the worst time for the Sino-US relationships is on the general election, then maybe because there's a trade deal, then maybe we can gradually reconcile the relationships. But now, because the pandemic, especially, and the crisis in states, maybe the hawks are still getting more momentums, so the situation may be significantly different, even become worse, or uncertainties has been increased. But I also mentioned just now already, that maybe now it's not at the moment for the totally pessimistic, the argument. I still think at the highest political levels, there's still sort of the willingness, and not to let relationships to go out of control. So that is the current observation. So given the circumstances, I think the both sides maybe can do several things. Number one, we should control escalation of the relationships in the negative direction, especially to manage the crisis in the issues like the Hong Kong, like the Taiwan, especially. So I think it's most important, not totally derail the relationships. Number two, I think there's still areas, especially in economic areas, both sides can collaborate. For example, I observed in the grain security issues, actually in the 2010, China banned export of the grain. I also wrote an article to comment on that policy, criticize of that policy, but this time, China did not. China actually take a very active role in stabilizing that. maybe there's some diplomacy behind the door, persuade the Vietnam, to cancel that kind of the suspending of the rice exportation. So that in that area, actually China and the US have a joint interest. China want to stabilize the market, also is on the line, on the same, how can I say, on the interest of the United States. On the other hand, you can see in the financial risks, actually you can see now I mentioned these three pillars. In the bilateral relationships, the United States provided the swaps of the currency swaps for your allies, something more than a dozen, maybe something a dozen countries, in the crisis period. China also offered swaps for maybe, and 35 or 40 countries, mainly developing countries. Actually, you can see this complementarity, and both sides do their jobs, but for the same objectives. I think both countries should emphasize these areas. They have a mutual interest. They can do, similar, jobs, and actually they collaborate, either whether they intentionally or not. I think maybe Steve, and you should promote these areas as the emerging sort of the agenda for collaboration at this circumstance. Number three, I think even for these kind of global value chain and the sort of the globalization, and the momentum and become stronger and stronger, I think communities, especially academic communities in both countries, should collaborate, should have some objective analysis on these issues. Number one, we must admit this crisis of pandemic reveals fragility and also vulnerability of this, global value chain and globalization. We should do something to, how can I say, improve or overcome the shortcomings of the globalization. So in other words, we need to looking forward, but we must make sure if we totally reverse the globalization, the cost will be huge. Actually globalization is rooted in my personal research of so-called, intra-product specialization originated from United States in 60s as part of your economic restructure program. Okay, it saves costs. If you want to reverse the process, you will have tremendous costs. So I think research communities on both countries can clarify these issues, and to make sure that we will not do too much, overshoot in that direction.
Nick and Bob, anything you want to add on that?
Well, my advice is that not much can be done on the US side. We're locked in. I think there's a huge potential in China. I'm very encouraged by the document that was released jointly by the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party and the State Council on May 18th, which talks about accelerating the transition to the socialist market economy. And it has within it many of the same themes that we saw in November of 2013 about making the market the dominant force in the allocation of resources, freeing up factor markets, and so forth. I think if China can demonstrate progress on that agenda, it will be extremely helpful. The fundamental premise, or a fundamental premise, of this new presidential document that I talked about earlier is that China has turned its back on economic reform, that they have not followed through on their commitments, and that they are not a market economy, and that they are distorting global markets and imposing costs on the rest of the world. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that, but one way to undermine that narrative is to reaccelerate or resume the process of domestic economic reform in China. Some of it is international, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of opening up the financial sector. But I'd be very interested in either Yao Yang or Lu Feng talking about, why did this document come out now? We know China's also had this internal debate. Should we rely more on the state or should we rely more on the market? It seems, maybe it's too simplistic an interpretation, that this document suggests that those that are advocating for a return to a more market-oriented approach are getting some traction, maybe have gained the upper hand. So is that true or not? And if so, what's the prospect for this very ambitious agenda to move ahead? I think it won't make much difference in the short run, but it could make a huge difference, particularly in the next presidential term if it's not Mr. Trump.
Yao Yang, Lu Feng, you want to answer? Yeah.
Well, I think Nick has actually summarized this well. You know, the reform has always been on the government and also the party's agenda. I think probably the pandemic also played some role here to accelerate the reform process. Reading that document and also the work report, I agree with Nick that reform agenda has come back more strongly.
Yeah, I think of course the more important from a U.S. China relations point of view, obviously reform, the third plenum reforms of the 18th Party Congress, implementing those would have a positive effect on U.S. China relations, but more opening in this period, more, you know, ending of equity caps, issuing licenses to U.S. financial institutions as is going on now would be extremely productive, because I think, I'm trying to remember who pointed it out, what we've seen, Yao Yang pointed out, is we've seen the American public turn to an unfavorable view of China. As Yao Yang pointed out, when we started these dialogues, it was in the 30s, it's now 66%, which is really damaging. But China could do a ton of things unilaterally, which would improve the relationship. So, you know, I hope some of those happens. Next question is from one of our directors, Nelson Dong, who says there are dozens, he's a partner at Dorsey. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of vaccines in development all over the world, including in the United States and China. Given the tensions and suspicions in the bilateral relationship, what is the likelihood either nation would accept and allow its own population to be vaccinated with a vaccine sourced from the other nation rather than waiting until its own indigenously developed vaccine produced and distributed under its own control? Anybody want to touch that one? Bob?
Steve, my view, whatever it's worth, we're in a terrible situation with respect to the mistrust in both each of our countries with respect to the other. Hopefully reason will win out, and if China develops what seems to be an effective regime, a vaccine, hopefully the CDC in our country will make an objective evaluation as to the quality and efficacy of the vaccine. But on the other hand, I think both in our current administration and publicly, I think the question's a good question. Whatever the CDC might say, there could be a lot of, I think there is a possibility of a lot of animus, a lot of the reaction toward the vaccine being affected by an animus toward China. But I think it's a good and serious question.
Yeah, Yang, Lu Feng, from the other end, would China accept one produced in the United States and distributed?
Definitely China will accept. And I think our worry is that if the U.S. has a vaccine first, then the Trump administration will ban that vaccine to be exported to China.
No idea.
I think what we should be thinking about in the United States is what happens if China is the first to develop an effective vaccine. I'm very interested in the program of Sinovac Biotech Limited, which began their phase 2 trials back in April and have announced that they are in talks to launch phase 3 trials globally. I don't know of any of the other vaccine prospects there are that are almost on the verge of phase 3 trials. Now, of course, a phase 3 trial is no guarantee it will be successful, but at least that company, Sinovac Biotech Limited, seems to be relatively advanced compared to the other programs we're reading about. So I sometimes think if I had a chance to tell Mr. Trump, I'd say, if I were you, I'd tone down your rhetoric. They may be the main source of the vaccine.
No doubt, Nick, he would engage with you intellectually and in a serious manner with respect to that observation.
Let's talk about, I think Lu Feng said we should be careful not to escalate in this environment, that, you know, it's important. There's a lot of, it's hard to find constructive things to do, though I think there are a few, but it's important that we not do destructive things. There's a view in the United States that that is precisely not what China is doing, that there are a lot of policies that are changing right now and leading to even a further worsening, whether it's the South China Sea, they're increasing incidents there, the Sino-Indian border, there seem to be incidents there with respect to Taiwan, and most importantly, with respect to Hong Kong, that the new national security law is creating a situation where it's possible that Hong Kong will be seriously damaged economically if foreign businesses decide that they're not prepared to remain there under the new legislative environment. So what's going on there? Obviously, Hong Kong is not as important. Back in 1997, it was 20% of China's GDP. Now I believe it's 2%, but what's going on? Why now? Obviously, the demonstrations have been very disruptive, but they seem to have calmed down during the pandemic. Now, as a result of these proposals, they've picked up again.
National security, you know, it says, of course, they want to still preserve the one country, two system, but they recognized, you know, and the current system is not in line with the objectives defined by the government for the national security. I think that is just, of course, you know, and there could be different opinions, but general argument is that on the number two observation is that actually they want to have two phases of implementation. Actually, now it says the People's Congress, you know, authorized to, how can I say, to creation some kind of a law in this area, but we still, you know, have to wait to see, you know, whether it will do it immediately and what kind of law we'll have. So that is only first step. Number three, maybe there may be some calculations, you know, and even, you know, there's some law in that kind of direction, you know, only targeting the political aspects, you know, like the Li Jiaqing recently says, hopefully that will stabilize the economic situation in Hong Kong, you know. I'm not an expert in that area, you know, and I know it could be very controversial, you know, and the area on which, you know, and I know the President Trump said they will have new documents maybe, you know, this week, later this week. It could be some new tensions. Hopefully they were managed, not too much, you know, and explosive in certain, to some extent.
Yeah, in a Washington that is virtually devoid of bipartisan consensus, there's a consensus that the United States needs to act because of the NPC's action on Hong Kong.
But Steve, look, I don't know. Hong Kong, I think, is going to be severely damaged by this if China goes ahead. But to what extent is that our business?
But the thing is that you know, this new move was actually based on Article 23 of the Basic Law. It was tried once in 2003, right? But failed. But last year's demonstrations showed so many people, particularly some of those young people, really were going to the other direction, that is independence of Hong Kong. So I think that was the major motivation behind this new move. The new move says NBC is going to pass some resolution, and then the attachment with the basic law, I think attachment 2, will adopt this legislation. Okay. But we don't know the specific contents of this regulation or laws. So I think it's too early for us to talk about the consequence of this new law.
I mean, to answer Bob's question, I think it absolutely is our business. There are international agreements in effect here. There are hundreds of thousands of Americans living there. There are commitments that China has made. But this program, tomorrow, I believe it's 8 p.m. We have a program precisely on this subject, which we will have in-depth discussion. Nick, was there anything? But I meant to focus on the economic, not on the political.
Yeah, I just want to make the comment that if the administration follows through on the kinds of threat they're talking about, of taking away certain status from Hong Kong, it will have, as you've already said, Steve, a hugely negative impact on U.S. companies operating there. It will have a hugely negative impact on the people of Hong Kong, and it will have a minuscule effect on China. China does not depend on Hong Kong the way this is an example of where there's no weighing of the costs and benefits. We want to impose some costs on China. If we go down this road, the main loser is going to be U.S. companies and the citizens of Hong Kong. And I don't know why we want to punish the citizens of Hong Kong for something that the government in Beijing is doing.
Yes, precisely. Anybody following the audit requirements that apparently will become law for foreign companies listed in the United States, where the prediction is we will see a delisting of Chinese companies on NASDAQ and NYSE? And do they want to comment on that and what we should be doing about that? Anybody following that?
Yes, locking has caused a lot of discussions in China. And on this issue, I think the Chinese government is quite determined to get rid of those kind of cheating, frauds, even when they happen, say, on stock markets in the United States. In the short run, probably there will be a shock, but in the long run, I firmly believe this is going to be good for Chinese companies.
Maybe there's a lot of discussion about the recent documents by by the senator, or about strengthening regulation with regard for the Chinese and the listed companies in New York. A lot of discussion and some worrying, but I think there's also some analysis says maybe and there will be no, how can I say, absolute sort of the change in the basic situation. The logic is still the similar way, similar to what Nick commented about just now, So I think most of the listed companies, of Chinese listed companies in America, is mutually beneficial. So if you delist it for most of the companies, I think the major loss will be on the U.S. side. Of course, China will also incur some kind of the losses. So maybe there will be further sort of the more vigorous sort of the regulation on that area, but not U-turn in that situation.
Joan Kaufman asks, what's the playbook for coming back Joan Kaufman's at Schwarzman Scholars. What's the playbook for coming back from the current brink in U.S. China relations? What immediate steps and longer steps should and can be taken?
Steve, I'll give you a very brief comment. I don't think anything, I agree with, I think Nick said it, others maybe have said it too, I don't know. Nothing's going to happen before the elections. Nick, you may be right. If Trump gets reelected, maybe we'll be in the same place. I have what may be an unrealistic hope that somehow there's somebody there would get rational about our self-interest, but maybe that's just unrealistic. But if Biden gets elected, I think they'll be, and they should be, very focused on our self-interest, and I think they'll be realistic. But hopefully they will also see that our realistic self-interest lies in the kind of constructive relationship that I described before, and they'll reach out. Then there's, hopefully, and there are various ways they could do that. An interesting question is, what does President Xi want? Does he ultimately want to have a constructive relationship conducted within competitive but well-established international norms, or is he aiming toward regional and global domination? And I think that that's a very big question, which will remain to be seen if, in fact, we have an administration that does reach out to him.
Yep. Anybody else want to comment on that? Then otherwise I have a question from Mike Lamb.
I think even after the general election, I don't think we can sort out all the structural, and the problems behind two sides. I think the best prospects we can hope is stabilizing the situation to allow the both sides to evolve, and for some time to come.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a piece which you're all welcome to really read in the South China Morning Post, where I said economic.
I read that. It's very good. It's very good, well-written article.
Yeah, economic and diplomatic competition are fine. We have them. It's okay. But China does not pose an existential threat to the United States, nor does the United States pose an existential threat to China. And characterizing each as existential threats to the other has damaging implications for the peoples of China and the United States. That's the short summary of a much longer piece. Mike Lampton is asking Bob. Mike is former president of the committee, the director of the committee. What advice would you give the Biden campaign in light of the Clinton campaign experience in '92 and '93 and boxing itself in on MFN, and then taking the first part of its first term, digging out of that mess? How do we do the least damage in this campaign that restricts subsequent flexibility?
Well, look, it's a good question, and I think unfortunately this campaign is going down a very bad road. So it's a good question. It's become pretty clear, I think, that Trump intends to engage in all kinds of criticism of China, perhaps to deflect attention from the way he's dealt with the coronavirus epidemic in the United States, although there's plenty to blame in China's part too. But I think he's using this as a way to deflect, my impression would be to deflect attention. And I think the Biden people, I'm not involved in the Biden campaign, I suspect you'll see them engage in some sort of a response that is also negative with respect, in some respects, to the China-U.S. relationship. I think we just got to get past that, Mike. And once we get past it, then it seems to me that if Biden gets reelected, or gets elected rather, that there are just a lot of ways that he could reach out, while at the same time being very aware that we need to know what is Xi's reaction going to be. Is he trying to develop regional and global domination over time, or will he be responsive to the effort to construct a relationship? I think there are a lot of ways that they could reach out, and then you can see what Xi's reaction would be. He's going to do what's in his electoral self-interest right now, and I believe that's right for him to do. And at the same time, I think he's a very I at least think that he's a very thoughtful individual with respect to these issues. And I think he'll be very focused on our self-interest. I'm repeating myself, very focused on our self-interest, that he should be, but that in that context, he will see whether there is an opportunity to work effectively with China and whether China is responsive to that, to an effort in that direction. Be my impression. I don't have any knowledge, just my impression.
From Fordham Law School, William Jenness asks, is there more U.S. China economic and investment cooperation below the headlines. So I guess it's for Nick or Yao Yang, or, well, I guess any of you. Is there stuff going on which the media is just not talking about, and it's not as horrible as it seems on the surface?
Well, I'll give you one perspective, and that is, if you talk to the working level people at USTR, they are very optimistic about their relations with their counterparts. There are many of the technical questions. They're practically in daily contact, trying to overcome different issues on implementation of phase one. And I think this is part of the reason that Mr. Lighthizer and Liu He were able to say that they think we're still going to be able to implement phase one. They're working very hard behind the scenes. You never read about any of these people in the newspapers, and you never read anything about exactly what they're doing, but they're in very intense cooperative discussions about many of the issues involved in the implementation of phase one. They don't have any difficulties communicating, and I think on each side, they're making the best efforts to get the agreement implemented. So that's one example, one agency of the US government. So it's not necessarily indicative of what's happening elsewhere.
Tesla is very happy about the investment in Shanghai. I visited that site of the investment. You know, it's going very, very quickly. And also, you know, and the time schedule of production has been implemented, you know, even better than planned. So that is also a piece of the evidence indicates, you know, not all the things and going wrong.
Last question, which is a great one because we're out of time, which comes from our Executive Vice Chair, Hank Greenberg, which is, doesn't it make sense where this relationship is that President Xi and President Trump should speak because of the absolute downward spiral that we're in, that Hank is basically saying this is what we need to do, have the two speak?
I'm not sure you're going to get the two leaders to speak to each other, but I do think what we're surely lacking in recent years has been any sustained high-level dialogue on a range of issues, including economics. Yes, the working level talks between USTR and their counterparts seem to be working fairly smoothly, but we don't have high-level talks between leaders on both sides. There's no structure. We've abandoned all of the programs that were tried in early administration. Yeah, maybe they weren't 100% successful, but I think we'd be much better off if we had more sustained high-level contacts between the two sides, whether or not it involves President Trump and President Xi.
Steve, I agree with Nick, and Hank is an extraordinarily shrewd observer of U.S. China relations, but I kind of think everything is going to be driven by politics from now until November. In the U.S., I mean.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Bob. We're not going to see anything substantial happening before November because Trump really wants to play this China card for his campaign.
Yes, I agree.
Lou Feng?
Yes, I agree. Generally speaking, I agree. Yes.
Well, the sun is now brightly shining in New York. I wish I could say the same on the U.S.-China economic relationship, but this has certainly shed an enormous amount of light on the relationship. I think the answers have been, I thank Yao Yang and Lu Feng for staying up close to midnight and educating our very large audience in the United States. I thank Nick and Bob for being here this morning. It has been a truly wonderful panel, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, Bob.